Hi, my name is Kendall Cahan, and in this video you'll see me turn this maple box, although it looks a little bit different than it did in the video because after I finished filming I decided it was a little bit too thick. So I deepened the inside slightly and thinned out a little bit of the top as well as removed the detail that I had put in. And I think the result is a lot better. But in this video you'll see the original turning. Okay, so I'm just mounting this maple blank onto some pin jaws with a hole that I drilled with a Forstner bit. And here I'm just cleaning off the bottom. And just truing up the sides for now. This is just some kind of rough shaping. And I'll mark the diameter for the tenon. And I want this to be the same size as the chuck jaws that I'm going to be using. And that way I can just take it out of the chuck finished and there won't be any marks left over from the jaws. And I'm adding a little bit of detail here on the foot. I learned this from Richard Raffan. And it's a really nice way to just very quickly add a little bit of interest to the bottom of a piece. And I'm just doing some push cuts here along the side of the piece just to get the final shape and a nice clean surface. And then here I'm sanding with 180 grit, and then I'll follow that up with 220. And then for the finish, I just like to use beeswax and walnut oil. So I do the beeswax first, and then I use a oil-soaked rag to just kind of blend all that in together. And just wipe off the excess. So that's the outside of the bottom done. And then I'll go ahead and start working on the top. Just makes sense to do this now instead of changing chucks. Okay, so I just needed to get a foot on that. And then I'll swap out the chuck jaws and reverse it. Now I can work on the inside of the top. Or actually, no, this is the bottom, and I'm just going to hollow it out before I start working on the top again. I'll just use a negative rake scraper to just kind of even out any little bumps or anything that are in there. And then I like to power sand with my first grit, especially on the inside of a piece where you're a little bit more prone to get picked up grain. I like to just start sanding with 120 power and then switch to hand sanding. So I went through 120, 180, and then 220 here at the end. And just applying the beeswax and walnut oil. And the idea is to just build up enough friction that the wax and the oil sort of melt in together. Okay, so because the foot was the right size for the chuck, there's no chuck marks, and the bottom is finished, and now I can start working on the inside of the top. Tool rest was a little bit too high there, so I just moved it down a little bit. And then there I was just putting the bottom up against the top just to get a kind of general idea of whether they were going to look right together or if I needed to bring one or the other down in diameter. And my camera stopped working in this section here, but I just added a little groove on the inside so that I could reverse the piece to work on the very top. And then I also added the little ledge there where it'll register with the bottom of the box. Okay, so just testing to make sure that the lid and the base are going to fit together nicely without too much slop. It can't be a tight fit like an end grain piece, because since this is cross grain, as the seasons change, the wood will expand and contract. And if you have a really snug fit now, especially it's winter time, so in the summer the lid will expand, and if you don't leave enough room, it will be impossible to get it off, or it'll crack the piece, worst case. And here I'm just sort of removing material to get down to a reasonable thickness for the lid. And I actually, after I filmed this video, I decided to go back and deepen the inside of the box and also slim down the lid because they were just a little bit thicker than I wanted them to be. But maybe I'll post that in a separate video. And here I'm just adding a little bit of detail to the top of the lid. This lid is actually small enough that it doesn't need a handle on it because you can reach your hand all the way across the top of the lid. But it's nice to just add a little bit of detail there on the top just for visual interest. And then after I recorded this video, I went back and removed the detail on the top because it was just adding a little bit too much weight, and I just felt like the piece looked a little bit too busy. And I'm just trying to kind of round over those edges of that kind of button detail on the top. They look really nice if they look like they're little beads sitting on top instead of just having straight sides. And there can be a lot of back and forth at this part where you're trying to just finalize the design and make sure everything looks correct. But I'll start sanding here. With this just needed 180, and then I'll move on to 220 like normal. I don't like to finish utilitarian pieces with a super high abrasive grit, because typically if you finish something too fine of a grit, with too fine of a grit, people are unlikely to use the item, or they're afraid to use it because they're afraid of ruining the finish. So 220 is usually good enough. And then just doing the beeswax and oil again. And that's the box completed.